Hello. I'm getting this ready. Let me see. La 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 la. Hello. Okay, today I am going over, it is lesson 3 of the new Jim Crow. I am using Teaching Tolerance. Teaching Tolerance, their website basically had like a whole bunch of lesson plans for teachers, and I was like, well, half the people I want to expose to this aren't in school anymore, you know? So it's like, I thought, well, if not when, if not who. So here we are. And these do run a little bit long, but it's basically a guided reading of the entire chapter. So we're reading the new Jim Crow, and there's 10 lessons. This is lesson 3. You can find all of the lessons on my website, www.southernfriedsocialist.com. And also, if you go there, I basically have handouts and student materials and exercises on my website, because this is more of a personal growth. You know, I'm not here, it's something that you want to work towards and you really want to understand the text, and here we go, we've got it. So today we're going over the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and it's chapter 1, The Rebirth of Caste. Now, this is set up like a classroom structure, and I don't have that. So what I've done is we're going to go over basically the nitty-gritty parts of the chapter, and then I am going to pause in between pertinent parts, and I'm going to ask critical thinking questions. Just questions to kind of get you thinking, think about the text. And if you want these questions to be able to test yourself, and see how you go or whatnot, then they are on the website as well, www.southernfriedsocialist.com. And then lesson 3. So I'm just going to jump in, and a lot of it I'm reading. I'm going exactly by Teaching Tolerance's lesson plan for this. So, and then here's the guided reading. And so instead of getting to do all that cool stuff like, graffiti and thinking note strategy and group strategy, I'm just going to have to pause and ask critical thinking questions, and you'll just have to ponder it. But anyway, and if I don't talk much about the comments, it's probably because I just want to get through the lesson first, because I use these on the website as well. If you do want to do this like a course, which I agree with, you would probably start at lesson 1, and then these will already be in there. So if you want to hear like a real live person breaking it down and kind of going, well, what do you think about this? These are perfect for that. So chapter 1, The Rebirth of Caste. The birth of slavery. The concept of race is a relatively recent development. Only in the past few centuries, owing largely to the European imperialism, have the world's people been classified along racial lines. Here in America, the idea of race emerged as a means of reconciling chattel slavery, as well as the extermination of American Indians, with the ideals of freedom preached by whites in the new colonies. Now, also, on the website, I have a vocabulary, and it goes over Amnesty, federalism, Reconstruction era, chattel slavery, what that means. So there is a vocabulary list on the website. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and give it to you in the video, in the comments, in the end notes. I'm going to give you the vocabulary and the end notes so that you can search and research to your own leisure, because it's so much better when we find out about our world than having somebody else tell us. This is just a book study. I've got tons of more books that we're going to do. Let me see. Where is it? Here we go. I found it. Yay. Ooh, it's creepy looking at me. Okay, comment. There we go. In the comments, you have vocabulary and you have footnotes. Moving on. In the early colonial period, when settlements remained relatively small, indentured servitude was the dominant means of securing cheap labor. Under this system, whites and blacks struggled to survive against a common enemy, what historian Lerone Bennett Jr. describes as the bigger planter apparatus and a social system that legalized terror against black and white bondsmen. Initially, blacks brought to this country were not all enslaved. Many were treated as indentured servants. As plantation farming expanded, particularly tobacco and cotton farming, the demand increased greatly for both labor and land. So here's you a good question. Can you can you describe the interactions that happened between blacks and whites in early colonial America? What was their dynamic together at the very beginning compared to what it has become and what it has before chattel slavery? The demand for land was met by invading and conquering larger and larger swaths of territory held by American Indians. The growing demand for labor on plantations was met through slavery. American Indians were considered unsuitable as slaves, largely because native tribes were clearly in a position to fight back. European immigrants were also deemed poor candidates for slavery, not because of their race, but rather because they were in short supply, and enslavement would, quite naturally, interfere with voluntary immigration to the new colonies. Plantation owners thus viewed Africans who were relatively powerless as the ideal slaves. The systematic enslavement of Africans and the rearing of their children under bondage emerged with all deliberate speed, quickened by events such as Bacon's Rebellion. So, before we even get into this, kind of think, what was Bacon's Rebellion? I'm about to read it to you, but what is Bacon's Rebellion? Why did it cause such an issue? What was happening that made other people go, oh, we can't do this. We got to fix this. Okay? Varying accounts of Bacon's rebellion around, but the basic facts are these. Bacon developed plans in 1675 to seize native lands in order to acquire more property for himself and others and nullify the threat of Indian raids. When the planter elite in Virginia refused to provide militia support for his scheme, Bacon retaliated, leading an attack on the elite, their homes, and their property. He openly condemned the rich for their oppression of the poor and inspired an alliance of white and black bond laborers, as well as slaves, who demanded to end their servitude. The attempted revolution was ended by force and false promises of amnesty. If you don't know, if you go to my blog, I do have the glossary terms for the book study that we're going over, if you do not understand some of the concepts. A number of the people who participated in the revolt were hanged. The events in Jamestown were alarming to the planter elite, who were deeply fearful of the multiracial alliance of bond workers and slaves. Word of Bacon's rebellion spread far and wide, and several more uprisings of similar type followed. In an effort to perfect their superior status and economic position, the planters shifted their strategy for maintaining dominance. They abandoned their heavy reliance on indentured servants in favor of the importance of more black slaves. Instead of importing English-speaking slaves from the West Indies, who were more likely to be familiar with European language and culture, many more slaves were shipped directly from Africa. These slaves would be far easier to control and far less likely to form alliances with poor whites. So right there, Bacon's Rebellion was a bunch of lower class people getting together, and it worked. And then that was kind of the birth of the divide between where there's a ruling class who starts to, no, you're getting too wild there. Moving on, using teaching tolerance, we're using Teaching Tolerance's lesson plan guide to the new Jim Crow. Fearful that such measures might not be sufficient to protect their interests. I skipped a paragraph. My bad. Fearful that such measures might not be sufficient to protect their interests, the planter class took an additional precautionary step, a step that would later come to be known as racial bribe. Deliberately and strategically, the planter class extended special privileges to poor whites in an effort to drive a wedge between them and black slaves. White settlers were allowed greater access to Native American lands. White servants were allowed to police slaves through slave patrols and militias, and barriers were created so that free labor would not be placed in competition with slave labor. These measures effectively eliminated the risk of future alliances between black slaves and poor whites. By the mid-1770s, the system of bond labor that had been thoroughly transformed into a racial caste system predicated on slavery. The degraded status of Africans was justified on the grounds that Negroes, like the Indians, were an uncivilized lesser race, perhaps even more lacking in intelligent and laudable human qualities than the red-skinned natives. The notion of white supremacy rationalized the enslavement of Africans, even as whites endeavored to form a new nation based on the ideals of equality, liberty, and justice for all. Before democracy, chattel slavery was born in America. It may be impossible to overstate the significance of race in defining the basic structure of American society. The structure of content of the original Constitution was based largely on the effort to preserve the racial caste system, slavery, while at the same time affording political and economic rights to whites, especially propertied whites, rich people. The Southern slaveholding colonies would agree to form a union only on the condition that the federal government would not be able to interfere with the right to own slaves. Federalism, the division of power between the states and the federal government, was the device employed to protect the institution of slavery and the political power of slaveholding states. Under the terms of our country's founding document, slaves were defined as 3/5 of a man. Not a real, whole human being. Upon this racist fiction rests the entire structure of American democracy. This is chapter 1. This is a summary of the entirety of chapter 1. The entire full, you don't have to buy the book. The entire full audio is on my website, so you can have the access to the entire chapter, and you can just listen to it. This is just a boiled down lesson plan that asks critical questions about the text when you're looking at it critically. The death of slavery. The history of racial caste in the United States would end with the Civil War if the idea of race and racial difference had died with the institution of slavery was put to rest. But during the 4 centuries in which slavery flourished, the idea of race flourished as well. Indeed, the notion of racial difference, specifically the notion of white supremacy, proved far more durable than the institution that gave birth to it. White supremacy over time became a religion of sorts, faith in the idea that people of the African race were bestial, that whites were inherently superior, and that slavery was, in fact, for blacks' own good. Service to alleviate the white conscience and reconcile the tension between slavery and the democratic ideals espoused by whites in the so-called New World. There was no contradiction in the bold claim made by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. If Africans were not really people, this deep faith in white supremacy was not only justified. An economic and political system in which plantation owners acquired land and oh, that just makes me so mad. I'm sorry. If Africans were not really people, this deep faith in white supremacy not only justified an economic and political system in which plantation owners acquired land and great wealth through the brutality, torture, and coercion of other human beings, it also endured, like many articles of faith, long after the historical circumstances that gave rise to the religion passed away. After the death of slavery, the idea of race lived on. One of the most compelling accounts of the post-emancipation period is The Strange Career of Jim Crow, written by C. Van Woodward in 1955. There's a footnote on this. I've attached vocabulary and the footnotes. As Woodward tells the story, the end of slavery created an extraordinary dilemma for Southern white society. Without the labor of former slaves, the region's economy would surely collapse, and without the institution of slavery, there was no longer a formal mechanism for maintaining racial hierarchy. This state of affairs produced a temporary anarchy and a state of mind bordering on hysteria, particularly among the planter elite, but even among poor whites. The collapse of slavery was a bitter pile in the antebellum South. The lowliest white person, at least, possessed his or her white skin, a badge of superiority over even the most skilled slaves or prosperous free African American. While Southern whites, poor and rich alike, were utterly outraged by emancipation, there was no obvious solution to the dilemma they faced. Following the Civil War, the economic and political infrastructure of the South was in shambles. Plantation owners were suddenly destitute, and the state government, shackled by war debt, were penniless. Large amounts of real estate and other property had been destroyed in the war. Industry was disorganized, and hundreds of thousands of men had been killed or maimed. With all of this went the demoralizing effect of an unsuccessful war and the extraordinary challenges associated with rebuilding a new state and local governments. Add to all of this sudden presence of 4 million newly freed slaves, and the picture becomes even more complicated. Under slavery, the racial order was not effectively maintained by a large degree of contact between... Under slavery, the racial order was most effectively maintained by a large degree of contact between slave owners and slaves, thus maximizing opportunities for supervision and discipline, and minimizing the potential for active resistance or rebellion. Strict separation of the races have threatened slaveholders' immediate interest and was, in any event, wholly unnecessary as a means of creating social distance or establishing the inferior status of slaves. Following the Civil War, it was unclear what institutions, laws, or customs would be necessary to maintain white control now that slavery was gone. Nonetheless, as numerous historians have shown, the development of a new racial order became the consuming passion for most white Southerners. Rumors of a great insurrection terrified whites, and blacks increasingly came to be viewed as menacing and dangerous. In fact, the current stereotypes of black men as aggressive, unruly predators can be traced to this period in time when whites feared that the angry mass of black men might rise up and attack them or rape their women. Equally worrisome was the state of the economy. Former slaves literally walked away from their plantations, causing panic and outrage among plantation owners. Large numbers of former slaves roamed the highway in early years after the war. Some converged on towns and cities, others joined the federal militia. Most white people believed African Americans lacked the proper motivation to work, prompting the provisional Southern legislators to adopt the notorious black codes. As expressed by one Alabama planter, "We have the power to pass stringent policy laws to govern the Negroes. This is a blessing, for they must be controlled in some way or white people cannot live among them," end quote. Although the convict laws enacted during the period are rarely seen as part of the black codes, that is a mistake. As an example by historian William Cohen, the main purpose of the codes was to control the freedom, and the question of how to handle convicted black lawbreakers was very much at the center of the control issue. 9 Southern states adopted vagrancy laws, which essentially made it criminal offense to not to work and were applied selectively to blacks. And 8 of those states enacted convict laws, allowing for the hiring out-of-country prisoners to plantation owners and private companies. Prisoners were forced to work with little or no pay. Clearly, the purpose of black codes in general, and the vagrancy laws in particular, was to establish another system of forced labor. Now, I'm going to pause right here, and this is a total side note, but you remember in Hillary Clinton's book, It Takes a Village, and that whole excerpt where she said that the Arkansas state governor uses prison labor because it keeps down costs, and it's a tradition, and that's what they do when you're the governor? Vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws. Vagrancy laws. Same thing. Life's a circle. Ultimately, the black codes were overturned and a slew of federal civil rights legislation protecting the newly freed slaves was passed during the relatively brief but extraordinary period of black advancement known as the Reconstruction era. That's a term on the vocabulary list that is also under this video and also on my website. The impressive legislative achievements of this period include the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and bestowing full citizenship upon African Americans, the 14th Amendment, prohibiting states from denying citizenship, due process, and equal protection of the laws, and the 15th Amendment, providing that the right to vote should not be denied on account of race, and the Ku Klux Klan Acts, which, among other things, declared interference with voting a federal offense and the violent infringement of civil rights a crime. Side note, we're dealing with Nazis right now, and this book was only written in 2010. The new legislation also provided for federal supervision of voting and authorized the president to send the army and suspend the writ of habeas corpus in districts declared to be in a state of insurrection against the federal government. While the Reconstruction era was fraught with corruption and arguably doomed by the lack of land reform and sweeping economic and political developments in that period, did appear, at least for a time, to have the potential to seriously undermine, if not completely eradicate, the racial caste system in the South. With the protection of federal troops, African Americans began to vote in large numbers and seize control in some areas of the local political apparatus. Literacy rates climbed, and educated blacks began to populate legislatures, open schools, and initiate successful businesses. Listen to this. In 1867, at the dawn of the Reconstruction era, no black man held an office in the South. Yet 3 years later, at least 15% of all Southern elected officials were black. I don't think that's the numbers now, so I think we've gone back in time. At the same time, however, many of the new civil rights laws were providing largely symbolic. Notably absent from the 15th Amendment, for example, was language prohibiting the states from imposing educational, residential, or other qualifications for voting, thus leaving the door open to the states to impose poll taxes, literacy tests, and other devices to prevent blacks from voting. Most blacks were too poor to sue to enforce their civil rights, and no organization like the NAACP yet existed to spread the risks and cost of litigation. Moreover, the threat of violence often deterred blacks from pressing legitimate claims, making the civil rights of former slaves largely illusionary, existing on paper but rarely found in real life. Meanwhile, the separation of the races had begun to emerge as a comprehensive pattern throughout the South, driven in a large part by the rhetoric of the planter elite, who hoped to reestablish a system of control that would ensure a low-paid, submissive labor force. Racial segregation actually began years earlier in the North as an effort to prevent race mixing and pre-service racial hierarchy following the abolition of Northern slavery. It had never developed, however, into a comprehensive system, operating instead largely as a matter of custom, enforced with varying degrees of consistency. Even among those most hostile to Reconstruction, few would have predicted that the racial segregation would soon evolve into a new racial caste system, as stunningly comprehensive and repressive as the one that came to be known simply as Jim Crow. That is the gist of Chapter 1. Chapter 1, the video for the entire audio, and I do believe it's the author reading the book. It's about an hour, but that was basically the juiciest parts from the entire book. And this is, I'm using Teaching Tolerance lesson plan for the new Jim Crow. And I'm having to adapt it to social media. So I just wanted to... So we've gone over the guided reading for Chapter 3. Here are the questions that I want you to mull over and to think over. So, like, the interactions that took place between blacks and whites in early colonial America before chattel slavery. When I read that question, I think they didn't all come over here as slaves. They came over as indentured servants. And then somehow through a system of oppression and, like, if we don't do something, then we're going to, like, lose out on something. That is how chattel slavery began. Like, so, like, I don't know, it really makes me wonder about intention, and like their intentions were bad. They had bad intentions. Why did plantation farming shift from using indentured servants as labor to enslaved African people? Like, remember that? Plantation owners thus viewed Africans who were relatively powerless as ideal slaves. They brought over people who wouldn't become friends with or form alliances with poor whites. They were like, we want somebody who doesn't speak English and who doesn't know anything, and they're going to be in culture shock the entire time. Those are the ones we want. We don't want anyone who will figure out what's going on or who can read. You know. What reason does the author Alexander give to explain why Africans were deemed as like ideal slaves? I think we just went over that. Like, that's a... Oh, you can fast forward through this, or you can listen to the entire chapter. And then Bacon's Rebellion. Like, do you understand how much of an impact that was? And like right now, you've got like people going Black Lives Matter and people saying White Lives Matter, and it's just like, well, number one, I live in Texas and Houston, all this, and like that would be like saying Houston Lives Matter, and somebody going all lives matter. Oh well, I'm sorry, we just got hit by her. Like, Black lives are like, there are statistics and numbers that prove that they're getting like gunned down in the street by our police officers at high rates, and nobody connects that. So, but if you're ever wondering why people are like, all lives matter, that's like having a crisis in Houston and me being like, Houston lives matter, and everybody's like, no, all cities matter. It's like, no, you understand why I'm saying all Houston lives matter. It's because there's an emergency going on. But if, ignorance is not bliss when you're oppressing your neighbor through not being involved. Sorry, that was a tangent. Anyway, how did the racial bribe that resulted from Bacon's rebellion help to construct the idea of race in America? Like that racial bribe. The one where the rich people were like, listen. I'll give you this. I'll give you, this all didn't happen back then, but I'll give you a nice car. I'll give you some money. I'll put so much money in your pack. I just want you to do this. Just do this, because I'm not going to offer it to them. The deal's not on the table for them. I need you to do this for me. Like, that thing is still, it's what helped build America, and it's something that's a reoccurring issue, but definitely that racial bribe. Let me go ahead and go back to it super fast. Where was it? Fearful that such measures might not be sufficient to protect their interests, as in the little laws and legislations that they passed beforehand, they thought, well, we need something more than that. We need something more. We need an inside person. The planter class took an additional precautionary step, a step that would later come to be known as a racial bribe. Deliberately and strategically, the planter class extended special privileges to poor whites in an effort to drive a wedge between them and black slaves. White settlers were allowed greater access to Native American lands. White servants were allowed to police slaves through slave patrols and militias, and barriers were created so that free labor would not be placed in competition with slave labor. Special privileges to people in a different class, and that also plays into that whole hidden caste system and how it was developed. Caste system is one of the vocabulary words that was from lesson 2, and that is also on my blog if you need it. And then I'm just going to go over a few other questions, and then I'm going to call this done because it's been a really long video, but I just want you to think about it and mill over it. This is you growing you and understanding the text, and feel free to go back or go straight to my blog, www.southernfriedsocialist.com, and I have the author reading the entire first chapter, and you can do whatever you need to do, and then the footnotes are on the bottom, and all the vocabulary is on my website. So, according to Alexander, how did white, and you can get these questions. These questions are online. I have given you this. And also, there's another fun exercise that I'm going to go over in a video and kind of do that. So if, a parent comes along and is like, I think my kid might need to do this, just show them my videos. And then if you want to print out the homework and make them do it, like if your kid said something racist and other parent called you and said, did you know that your child said this? Oh, we don't deal with, I know I sound Southern and Judd Clampety, but I don't deal with racial slurs up in my house. I'd sit them down, and if there was somebody else, if this was already out there somewhere, I would have made my kid sit down and do the entire lesson. Okay. Alexander writes, the history of racial caste in the United States would end with the Civil War if the idea of race and racial differences had died with the institution of slavery, and the institution of slavery was put to rest. How does this statement potentially inform or change your responses to the warm-up? Now, that's a good question, because if you go to my website, www.southernfriedsocialist.com, I have the warm-up exercise, and some of this is kind of like, I want you to explore you, and you to, take in what we're saying. How does Alexander explain the South's dilemma after the Civil War? Can you go back in the reading and, that's a good question. What was the economic impact of emancipation on the South? How did emancipation affect those rich slave owners? How? Did it, maybe that's why they started something that was horrible, was because they were directly impacted and upset by it. Let's see. What was the role of contact under slavery? Why do you think Alexander is pointing to this in her discussion of the death of slavery? what did the Southern white elite accomplish by passing black codes? Like, I want you to just kind of, you know, go back. All these questions are on my website. If you want to go back, this is, you can get the student version. I have the teacher version, but you'll have the student version. This is everything that I just read out loud, you know. So if you need auditory access, there's me that reads this out loud, or you could do it. But anyway, thank you for being with me, and we've gone over Lesson 3, Guided Reading. I just wanted to go over the chapter with everybody, and I wanted to make sure that everybody knew that there is vocabulary and the footnotes. And I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and just, this is just so important to me, and I'm just so happy that you're here with me. Thank you so much. And if you need, if you're a mom who's helping her kid talk about this subject, I've got the student printouts on my website. I try to stay clean in my videos, although things slip. But let's see. And then also, if you have a question, please ask it. If you're talking with others, do not attack the person, attack the statement. So, no fighting. Be kind, be nice, be respectful. And lesson 1 is all over how to talk about race and racism in a very respectful way. And I would appreciate it if you would check that out before you engage with others, just in case. So, thank you, and ta-da! Lesson 3 done!